Really like you, bro. You're a really interesting guy.
Thank you.
I love your work, and I love what you do with this too. So I had asked if Lewis would come back on the show and do a part 2 with me. Fascinated by his book, The Book of Sasquatch, and very interested in the guy and why he wrote it, how he wrote it, and his background. So I've got him back. And Lewis,
good to be with you.
Lewis, I've got you back. We were talking off air again. I got a lot of emails last time that people were talking about the fact that you do polygraphs with sex offenders. Talk with us a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Well, first thing, you will notice in the book that got me on the show, the Book of Sasquatch here, that I have set the book around the town. It's a mythical town called Deception Falls, right? And Deception is a vehicle. It's placed in the state of Washington. And it's in the whole forest and around Mount Olympus there, beautiful country, right? But I use deception a lot, extensively as a vehicle in the book because, first of all, deception is something I very much understand, right? But also as a literary device, if you will, right? This is a place where a lot of deceptions fall, right? And I make note of that in the book. So I do have this curious profession that I'm doing now. And my background, I am these days a polygraph examiner. And my background is that I used to work as a probation officer in Westchester County, New York. And for a number of years, I ran the program that was constructed there for sex offenders. And it was always a good program, but after we brought in the polygraph as a component to it, recidivism frankly fell through the floor. We went through a 5-year period where recidivism rates for new sex offenses for our population, which was substantial. We had over 300 men under supervision at different times. The recidivism rate was 0 for 5 years running. And so
it's interesting.
Yeah. Now you have to, when we talk about polygraph, there's a lot of stuff out there about polygraph, in the media, and some people regard it as pseudoscience and all the rest of it. There is science involved, the science of physiology, but there's also art, because what we're trying to do here is make sure that we have a handle on what's going on with these men. And I say men because 99.5% of the offenders are male, right?
Yeah.
And a number of years ago, the use of polygraph was pioneered, frankly, in the Pacific Northwest, in using the polygraph with sex offenders. And the state of Colorado did a lot of good work with it in the 1990s and published a lot of research. So it's used to help people, first of all, not keep secrets about a part of our lives that most people do keep somewhat secret, appropriately so, right? We do keep our relationships private, our sex lives private, that kind of thing. But with sex offenders, many times secrecy gets distorted, right? And so we have to be on the lookout for issues with these men for when they start keeping secrets around who they're having relationships with, right? We don't do this for the vast majority of people under supervision. We really only do it for people convicted of sex offenses. Because number one, there's the risk that these people present, which is extraordinary in some cases, not all. But I have done polygraphs. I did one polygraph a few years ago in upstate New York, where after 4 hours of interview and completing the polygraph, we had a victim tally of about 425 underage victims. Okay. They ask, how is that possible? Right? Ultimately, he was caught on a child pornography charge. Right. But when you looked at this particular person's lifestyle, he was involved in a biker gang and ran, bars, and then he ran, activities for rock bands. I'll leave it at that.
Oh, wow.
And that gave him extraordinary
access to
right.
Right. I just,
yeah.
I go ahead. I've got a comment I want to make, but go ahead.
Now remember though that we knew him from the official records for possessing child pornography. And yet when we dove into everything that went on with him, there were all of these, what we call hands-on victims that no one knew about, right? And there's a book that came out several years ago called Rape in America. And it's crystal clear that the vast majority of sex offenses go unreported in this country.
Yeah.
And that allows a lot of these people to, frankly, victimize a lot of people before they are ever caught. Hey, there's my son, Sam, in the
There's
back.
your son. Give me a wave.
Sam, say hi.
Give me a wave, Sam. There he is.
This is Louis B. Free. We're on the radio
Sam,
right now.
How are you? How you doing? That's great. I love that.
Yeah.
Again, it disturbs me. I didn't know we were going to go this far in this direction, but I'm glad because it's important, Louis. It's important. What really, I want to try to not make this sound not too crude. What really upsets me, no, it's more than upset. What really enrages me, that's the best I can say it, is when someone is about to be sentenced.
Okay.
And they're talking with the judge, anything you want to say, or wherever in the process. And they say, well, I was abused as a child, or I was victimized as a child. And I'm going to tell you why, Louis Conte, why that bothers me so much. I was sexually abused as a child. And I often said, and I've said this on the show, I would love to, and I know this is without, I've had lawyers say, well, you can't do that. You couldn't do that. You beat this. Okay, whatever. I would love to be sitting in that seat and say, now I was going to sentence you to 50 years. Now I'm sentencing you to 100 years because you should be the last person to hurt a child. We know that hell. We know that. I know that hell.
Right,
I know what that, I'm an old guy.
Right.
Again, I'm not like, oh, poor me. I was victimized. I survived and I thrive. I'm not a victim. I was victimized. But the fact that they will use that as an excuse, if you will, or as some justification for hurting a child, obviously I'm enraged. Sorry. To my very core, because those of us that have been victims, we should be the very last. We should be the great protectors and defenders of kids. And when I hear that as an excuse or whatever, it enrages me. I'm sorry.
Actually, I appreciate you saying that. First thing I want to say is
sorry. I went off, bro. Sorry,
Don't worry about it at all. And thank you for being so forthright about it. It's you're doing everyone a service by talking about it, which is why I'm always happy to talk about this issue. There's a lot of folks out there who say that being sexually abused makes you more likely to be an abuser.
Yeah, I hate that.
And not only, you're sort of right to hate it because I don't find that to be the case. One of the
thank you for saying that, by the way. Thank you for saying that.
Well, one of the types of polygraphs we do is a sexual history polygraph. They can take a long time, and depending on the age of the person, the complexity of their life, it's about their whole lives, right? Yeah. Don't worry, I'm not going to do one with you today.
No. Let's. You know what? I'm pretty much an open. I'm in my 69th year, and it's like, what are the secrets at this point?
I got, I've sort of, I'm with you on that. I'm 61, and I'm gonna.
It's like,
this is what you got. Like, okay, this is where it's at. Right?
It's like,
So, generally, now there are some, of course, right, who do report that. Many people, although the vast majority of them do not cite that as the reason, at least in interviews with me, that they did what they did. If there is a general pattern that I can kind of glean from all the work I do, and I've done over 1,000 polygraphs at this point, right, is that the men are men who have seen other people victimized, and then not seen a justice response to that victimization. And this creates a mindset within them that they think that if I'm secret enough, that I can do. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the victimization experience is not, to me, not a significant driver.
The one thing that's interesting to me is, and we're going I love the direction because it's important because of your experience, and I appreciate what you're saying and educating us on this, Louis. But one of the things that I don't know, the mystery of sexuality, what creates, why do people have certain, I'm going to use the broad term, fetishes? Why do certain people like certain clothing or certain, whatever? I don't want to get it. But and I wondered that, and I've often wondered, what does, when I think back to, when I was a kid and being abused, what created that sexual desire for a child? I've wondered what happens. Being sexual. I understand being sexualized, and I understand, for me, when I got older, again, I've been very open about this on the show. Promiscuity and drug use and abuses, and was when I thought back and I started having the memories of it. That kind of, I hate to say explained, I'm saying, okay, I kind of get it. I was killing pain and I was looking for love and whatever. Gotcha. I get that as a young man, teenager and young adult. But what creates that with someone to have the desire for sexual gratification with a child or with a young? Go ahead.
What happens is, and let me first begin by saying, Polygraph is not a standalone in managing these guys, right? There are treatment professionals who work with them. They're amazing people to do this kind of work, I might add. And then there's the probation officers who supervise them and parole officers who supervise them. So this is part of an approach to managing this population. In terms of why someone distorts their sexual energy towards being interested in minors, right? It's usually something that occurs over time. And an important issue becomes, is this person exclusively interested in, young people? Or is that just something else they did in addition to other things, right? And this so this touches on the issue of what we call crossover offending, right? Just in the case I mentioned to you, again, looking at child porn online, and then additionally having hands-on victims. There are many people who never have hands-on victims, right? And their crimes are internet crimes. And then there are some people who, they go down the whole menu, and we get into some very, odd behaviors. But in terms of working with them, right? In the community, what the therapists try to do, obviously, is we're trying to steer the sexual interests to adult appropriate relationships, right? And that's for some men, that's not an issue. Their behavior was an outlier and they got caught, right? And then for some men, there definitely is a sexual attraction. They're socially isolated, and it's a problem. It's a management problem.
Yeah, that's and I very much appreciate you saying that about victims, whether you do it like a sexual history on them.
And we look for a number of things there. I mean, I end up asking a lot of health questions, right? Have you ever had brain trauma? Have you ever suffered a series of concussions, things like that? Because there is a link between, brain
Really?
dysfunction. Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's very. There's the research on this is kind of clear. So, I mean, and if your listenership will think about this, remember all the controversy with NFL players and encephalopathy that they suffer, and how when they leave the game, all of a sudden these guys are getting arrested for all sorts of things, and it's the all sorts of issues, right?
It's
And it
interesting.
has
Yeah.
to do with ongoing brain trauma. So
So it
we
affects
check for all that
some
kind
part
of
of the
stuff.
brain. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of, first of all, let me explain this for your listenership. None of this is done to anybody under supervision without a valid court order, and directing this as a condition of their supervision. Okay, so this isn't just done on anyone, and I would never propose that polygraphs be done on, we shouldn't be polygraphing our kids. We,
Yeah.
a number of years ago, there was a law passed to protect people, on job sites from being, harassed by polygraphs every 6 months and that kind of thing. Because that used to go on a lot more. It used to go on, prior to the passage of what they now call the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, right? And it's also, nowadays, of course, it used to be done in retail a lot, to make sure that people weren't stealing products and stuff like that. That's effectively ended, with the passage of that law.
See.
So the vast majority of work, that I do, and there's some government polygraph examiners within federal agencies who do polygraphs for, other reasons. Interestingly, there's a lot of research that's been done on polygraph question sets by the United States Air Force, right? And which is sort of interesting. They have some question sets that they developed in their work. So
That's interesting. It's got to be tough sometimes for you, working with that population, because I know you feel deeply. I know you're
right. But this is interesting. First of all, I begin from a place where we have to acknowledge that everyone, walking around has been untruthful in their lives at some point, right? So I don't set a tone in the interview that I'm here to, quote unquote, rip the truth out of you, but I do want to create an environment where a person is encouraged to disclose stuff. I do not ask time, date, and place, and I tell the person that. I tell them I am not looking here to jam you up with new criminal cases. And I joke with them, and for most guys it's a joke, although some days you wonder. I tell them, if you blurt out that you have chopped up bodies buried somewhere in the backyard, first of all, it no longer matters how you do on the polygraph, right?
Why am I laughing at that? It's horrible, right. But it's fun. It's fun if you're telling them that front, yeah.
But I tell them we're here to look at your behavior. Yeah. Right? We're here to look at your behavior so that the treatment therapists understand what's gone on with you in the past, because that has an impact on what you may do or may not do in the future. It is about managing risk, but we want you to be successful, right? To be successful in the program and do what you need to do. We need you to be 100% honest, right? And then I explain how the machine works, how the instrument works.
If I may, Louis Conte, mm-hmm. when I think about it, it's and you're the expert here, certainly not me. But when I'm thinking about it, if someone is in if they're court ordered into to be drug tested or something, or they're in drug rehab mm-hmm. or whatever, mm-hmm. It keeps them, I hate to say honest, not that they're not going to be, but if you're going to be treated, you need to know what's really going on. You really need to know
Well,
what's going on. And if they're drug testing them and they find out that they're using something in their court, not then the whoever's working with them, the counselor, the therapist, the treatment facilitator, whatever,
right.
knows it's not, are they telling me the truth? Did they lie to me or whatever? Then they can pursue that from I'd say in a good way, but in a helpful way, as opposed to a punitive
do you know,
way, right?
Exactly. And do you know folks who are part of 12-step programs?
I do.
Okay.
I'm not, but I do. I'm not
gotcha.
personally, but I do.
Yeah, no, I hear it. One of the things in 12-step programs, in AA, they talk about taking a searing moral inventory at some point. That's one of the steps, right? And that's kind of what needs to happen here with these folks, in that we need to know what's gone on, right? And the other thing is they need to say it, right? Because it's important to think about what really goes on with behavior. And, inevitably, we give ourselves a series of permission slips, right? If we're going to go down the road towards, doing something that's wrong. I'll use myself here as an example. It would be okay if I had a little bit more ice cream tonight.
Yeah.
And that's that becomes a permission slip, really, that I kind of grant myself. But we need to understand that process with some of the offenders, because once we understand that process, then we can come up with a plan to divert people, right, into other ways of, right. So if someone is having disturbing sexual fantasies, this now touches on, which we did not discuss, whether I can use a certain word on the radio.
Okay, hold on. The Louis B. Free, the Louis B. Free radio show, Brain Food from the Heartland, is an adult-oriented show intended for and only for a mature adult audience. Listener discretion is strongly advised. That means, folks, if you can't hang, drop off now. Go ahead. Right. Any word is okay. Now.
So the word the issue I'm getting to is, if you have someone who has sexual fantasies about sexual contact with minors, right? Commonly used in therapy is that therapists advise the people not to masturbate to those fantasies.
Okay.
Right. And to instead
masturbate was the word. Masturbate was
that was the word I was.
Louis, I have to tell you, and I appreciate that's very respectful of you. But that's like when I've done the disclaimer. I'm used to hearing something. I appreciate you. No, I'm serious. I mean that. That's what. I'm waiting for the word. I'm waiting for the the F word or.
No, we're not going there. We're not going there. But
you're wonderful. I like
thank you,
bro. You're a good guy.
What I will say is, and this is absolute truth here. The first person who uses the word masturbate in a room owns the room. That's always been something, that's always been something I've observed,
The first person that uses the word masturbate owns the room. Is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
If you're doing a presentation, that's a word that will, everyone gets kind of quiet when you use that word. So
I love that. It's a great quote.
Yeah. So, but that's part of the treatment process, right? And so if someone is having fantasies that are not appropriate, we have to address that. Well, very, very rarely in our lives do we meet people who openly discuss their sex lives.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Sure. Of course. Honestly.
Which is appropriate,
honestly.
Right?
To discuss it honestly. You have people that are bragging or whatever. Or
right.
Boastful, yeah. I hear.
And all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. But it's important here to really examine that. And so what I seek to do, and I tell them kind of what they're up against in the room, the way a polygraph works. And really the way it works is we're measuring physiology associated with what we call the fight or flight response.
That's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, because ultimately a question in a polygraph that we're not being honest about triggers the same physiology, right? And I always explain to the person, what are we really doing here? Well, this is not a mind reading machine. I'm not a mind reader. There is no such thing as a mind reading machine, right? But what we're looking at is your hardwired physiological response to what you perceive as a threat, right? And I use the example of, you know, imagine you're at the shopping center and you're loading your car with groceries in the parking lot, when all of a sudden behind you, you hear cars crashing, you hear sirens going off, you hear people screaming, running through the parking lot, bags of groceries spilling on the floor, and you turn around and you look up and you see a Tyrannosaurus Rex storming through the parking lot at the supermarket, hunting down and eating poor Ohioans in the parking lot, right? And now the monster turns towards you, right? Well, what do you experience there, right? And what we all experience is we call the fight or flight response. And there are things that the polygraph measures associated with that. And the point is that a question and a test that we're not being honest about represents a threat, and those responses can be measured, right? That's how the polygraph really works, all right? Now, there's a number of things that you have to do with a person to get them in the mindset to sit down, take the test, but they know they have to deal with this instrument that measures their physiology. And so the other thing I have to do is create the atmosphere for disclosure, right? I have to convey to a person, I'm going to be fair to you. I have no desire to say anything about you that isn't true when I ultimately write this report. I want this to be fair.
Yeah. And you're a nice guy. And I feel that about you. I sense that about you. Right. I sense that about you when you and I first spoke about your book, the Book of Sasquatch. I get that sense of you, where someone would be comfortable with that. I'm not, right. I've never had a polygraph, so I can't say what other people are like. Yet I sense that about you. That comfort, because that comfort level of not.
Well, here's, the approach I think is very important. If you, and let's be clear here, if you're measuring the fight or flight response, you really don't want to terrify or piss someone off, because then you're triggering exactly so you have to set up an atmosphere where there's some trust and buy-in from the person, right? And one of the principles people don't understand is, even with a court order, I explain to the person, yeah, I got a judge's order saying you have to take this test. However, I can't put things on your body and measure your physiology unless you agree for me to do it, because there's no way for me to do this to you. I'm not going to hold a person down and polygraph them against their will, right? I mean, you can't, there's no way to do that. So there's always, even at that level where people might say, well, isn't that coercion? Well, it's not that it's coercion. They need to do this to proceed in the program, right? They need to do this to make progress, right? So if there's a coercive effect, I mean, there's also a coercive effect in alcohol treatment, in drug treatment program. So that's always in play. But at the same time, if a person doesn't consent, I can't do the test. So everyone is afforded, what one could probably term informed consent, right? So it's important that, first of all, you establish that you're a fair person, that you care about the person, you want them to do well. I tell them, I want you to walk out of here knowing that you were a stand-up guy and you were 100% honest. Because I tell them, think about what that means for everyone who's working with you, right? And down the road, that may mean that you can go back to family functions if there's a plan, right? If there are going to be kids around, that kind of thing. If that's the nature of the issues that got the person in trouble, right? All those sorts of things. So we're constantly eliciting buy-in, right, into this program, because again, polygraph is just part of what we use with this population. And when people say, how does that impact your writing and stuff? If you really look at the novel, Book of Sasquatch, it's a book about redemption. Right? Yes. Yeah. And so, it's many beautiful. Times, yeah. And that, so first of all, I think we have to come to a place in society where we're not throwing people away anymore, right?
Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, let's look at that, right? When we look at who's incarcerated in this country, minorities are disproportionately represented, right? So and it's complicated. I don't want to oversimplify it or, speak to issues that I'm not an expert on, but that's a problem. That's a problem we should all be concerned about, right? Because there's a justice issue here. And so all of us need to examine what's going on with people, that this is the end result, right? Because I've worked in the system for all these years, right? And those sorts of things are a problem that we need to examine. And when I say we can't throw people away, that means in the vast majority of cases, my belief is we can manage people in the community, provided that we have the correct programming in place to work with them. Okay.
That's interesting, because
yeah.
one of the things, forgive me, Louis, but one of the things that is, and again, you know this, obviously I don't. I was going to say many times, you know this, that population and a lot of the individuals. But for me, when I hear of something where somebody, well, they were convicted in whatever, 10 years ago, 20 years ago of hurting a child, and then they're back in court and they did this or
escalated.
And I'm wondering, why are they out? Why are they out?
Right.
What
well, there's some
when you cross that line, that line again, what is that line? We could get into details, et cetera, et cetera. To me, you cross that line, you hurt a child. Right. You need to be in an all adult community. You need to not have access to another child, because again, myself, and I'm going to say I'm fine. My audience is going to say, no, Louis, you're not, you're whacked. But the reality is I understand. I understand on my level the impact, the negative, with the damage that can be done to a child. And certainly there's a lot.
Absolutely.
Why in our society do we allow them? But you're saying if the programs are in place, proper programs.
First of all, let's look at this. But not everyone has offended against children. Direct, right?
Yeah.
So
I'm talking
that's one thing,
about children.
Right?
Yeah, that's good.
And actually, there's an amazing array of behaviors that that go into them. All of them are problematic and require a structure in place, right? For instance, people who I'll use that word again, masturbate in public, right? Yeah. We have a tendency to pass jokes about that kind of behavior. We really shouldn't, because it's obnoxious behavior, right? And it actually is on a certain level aggressive, right? And so, we need to be aware, right? All of these people are different. The label sex offender doesn't really capture the range of behaviors. We have some people who are not doing this again, whatever it was, right? And I think about people who, people who, offended with a teenager.
Yeah, when they were a couple of years older. Again, and I get that. When I hear that the kid was like 19 and the girl was, I don't know, whatever. I'm not categorizing that as
Yeah, and I think there's a difference. Certainly. Right. But a 34-year-old with a 13-year-old, hold it, right? Yes. You were supposed to be the adult, right? So that's a different kind of thing. And so there's a range of behaviors here. There's internet offenses. There's all this sort of stuff. But we also need to keep in mind that the potential for really horrific victimization is always present, right? When you think about it, Louis, there's never been a serial killer who has also not been a sex offender.
Wait a minute. There's never been a serial killer that was not a sex offender. Wow.
Correct. When you look at it, as far as I know, now there may be an outlier out there, but when the FBI is, when you look at, when the FBI is, or any law enforcement agency is suddenly realizes, my God, we have a serial killer, in our state. They're thinking about who the sex offenders are, right? And because some guys do make this, horrible transition from a sex offender into being a serial killer, right? They are vanishingly rare, but they're there, right? And we have to be aware of that all the time. That said, there's only in the 1,000 I've done been a handful of people, I think, who could ultimately go down that road, right? Which is
it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. But you have to be aware of that, right? But in the vast majority of cases, we need to keep in mind that people can contain their behavior. They can make changes. There's a myth out there that people don't change. And I think that's nonsense.
Yeah,
right?
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Yeah. It's also an excuse, right?
Excuse for bad behavior. Yeah. Well,
exactly.
I was, this and that. Right. Yeah. Well,
I can't change. Nonsense. People change every day, and make change in their lives every day. So, part of what I try to do is convey the message. You can change. It starts with knowing what you did, right?
You know what's, go ahead. You were going to say something else.
Once we know what you've been doing, we can come up with a plan to help you not do that again, because there's always a process to it, right? That's in our own romantic lives, right? You're married, if I recall you saying.
I am. Yes, sir.
Right. So, listen, when we're romancing our wives or our girlfriends, we're taking them out for dinner, we're getting them, whatever the deal, that's all great, right? That's part of human behavior, right? And that's fine. But when a 34-year-old is doing that with a 14-year-old, that's grooming, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a different thing.
Yeah.
See, but you can interrupt that behavior, the professionals.
You know what I find, and we're going to have, we're not going to, you don't have to, but I'm going to invite you back for a part 3, because I want to talk about the Book of Sasquatch more. And I got great response when you were on with me last time, Louis Conte, but I've got to ask you this. When you, for what's interesting, the more I'm learning about you, and I'm very impacted by the book and understanding the background and your background with your kids. But I've got to ask you this. For you, sometimes people will say, well, they're hardened because of what they know. I think about the people that you've done the polygraph for, the people that you've worked with. You've worked with people who've committed crimes, and in some cases, very, very horrific crimes. Again, forgive me for going on and on, but I think about some of the cops that I know and the things that they've investigated, and authors that I've had on that have written, true crime, just some of the things that, how that could, I can see how that could impact someone's view of the world. If you're seeing that, if you're a police officer and you're going from crime to crime all day and you're seeing people hurt each other and horrible things, I certainly can understand how that could, what do I want to say? Impact your view of the world, of people. You are a very kind guy. You're a very hopeful guy. You're a very optimistic guy. You're a very positive guy with things. Where do you think that comes from? Am I making any sense?
I hear you. Well, first of all, I do believe in the ability of people to change. And because I've seen it, so it's not something that is, to me, it's not that remarkable. But when my wife says to me, geez, the book starts out, that your Sasquatch is not like the Sasquatch and Harry and the Hendersons, who I love.
No kidding.
I love that.
No kidding.
Isn't that a great? Oh yeah. No. But my guy's a very different guy.
Well, he's because of the experience, though.
Right.
Giving it away.
And so what I've got there is this character who begins, of course, in a very angry place, right? And then as time goes on, we start, his humanity begins to, become more rounded. And he even says at one point in the book, perhaps I've been overly harsh in my judgments of people, right? Which is because what does Sasquatch do earlier in the book? I mean, he kind of triggers a massacre. He does all sorts of all sorts of things that are, we would sit there
Yeah.
and go, wow, but the point of the book is redemption and that transition, from a person who's angry and hateful into a person who in the end really makes an amazing sacrifice, right?
So where does that come from in you?
I see this in people, and I think we see it every day, but we don't in other people, but we often don't. We're all amazed right now by this guy who's leading, Ukraine, right?
Yeah,
Right.
Zelensky. Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's kind of important to remember that this guy was a stand-up comedian, right?
Yeah. When you think of his background, dancer, comedian, actor.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we're presented now with this guy who, was kind of an entertainer. And listen, we have this view of entertainers as being kind of shallow, right? But really, if you think about it, someone who's doing that kind of thing has to always be thinking about what other people are thinking. And that made him a really good, in a sense, censor of his nation, right? And now in this crisis, all of a sudden, this other aspect to his personality comes out. We see this all the time in people, right? And I think there's a bias in the news. It's understandable towards the negative, right? I remember, several years ago, there was an act of anti-Semitism, in my county, and everyone in the news covered that, right? But I also saw, ministers and priests and people who weren't Jewish showing up at the temple to offer support, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what we also need to remember. There's two sides to humanity, right? No, so when I'm sitting, in a polygraph with a guy, I recall one interview a couple weeks ago where a guy said, look what I've lost here. So, my family, my reputation. Now my picture's on a website. I said, do you want to be that guy on the website? Or do you want to be something better? Right?
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're an interesting human. You really are. And when I think about that, you talk about, because again, we're so quick to look at all the evil in the world or the bad, and again, and not and missing, just like with the pandemic. Look at the outpouring of people that we talk about how awful and hateful people are of each other, and these crimes and these crimes like the anti-Semitic. Right. And then you see people looking after their neighbor, checking up on them. Do you need anything?
Exactly.
Going to the store, and again, it was funny experience for me, Louis, that because it was, it was a younger person that said, if you need, I can drop groceries. It's like, God, am I that old that they reach out to your senior citizens, reach out to the seniors that they shouldn't be put in contact with people because of the pandemic, et cetera. But it's beautiful though. And sometimes we forget that. And one of the things for me during the pandemic is the little human interactions that I've had over the last couple of years seem to mean so much more to me. And I've talked about this a lot on the show, and I'm not sure if it's an age. It may be an age thing for me, and it may be the pandemic or a combination of them. Just the little smiles, the little discussions that you get into with people out in the world. And most people are good people.
Right, I agree.
And for you, it's one thing for me. I can put the newspaper down. I can not watch the news. I cannot, but you're interacting with people, and in some cases have committed some horrific crimes, yet you stay a positive, optimistic, loving human. And I think that's amazing.
No, thank you.
And your experience and with your book, what kind of dad you are and how you write the Book of Sasquatch. Thank you. It's good. It's inspirational and good for us to hear someone with your experience to be able to stay the way you are. Like I say, I can understand. Well, thank you. I can understand how some people that investigate crimes, some people that do polygraphs, hear horrific things, how it can start to skew is the only word, change, impact their view of the world.
It can. And it's important to kind of pull back from that. See, that's what writing does for me. It allows me to sort of, pull back a little, think about what's going on between my ears, right? and also look at the larger context of what's going on for people. So I mean, that's why I write. And I joked with you last time that writing this book was selfish, in a way, because first of all, I like the characters so much. Every now and then, if I'm feeling a little depressed, I'll go, open up the book and remember something I wrote, and it's kind of it kind of helps put everything in perspective.
Yeah. It's a beautiful book, beautiful story, and I hope you'll come back and do this. I want to talk more with you. Ongoing discussion if you've got time. Louis Conte, again, the Book of Sasquatch is a book. I appreciate what you share with us in your view of the world, knowing that you're there.
Well,
we'll do it again. Thank you.
We will. Be well.
Thank you. What an incredible human being he is, folks. Again, the book, we've got links up at louisfreeshow.com. The book,